The Truth About Goblins. Chapter 55. Confusion. Pain. Annie ripped herself away from the man on the floor. Her mind was spinning, disoriented. What was that? Her fingers went to her lips. She looked down at the floor where the man lay motionless. Only, in her mind, it was herself who was on the ground. She was that magician, the woman was her wife, the child was hers. The child. She groaned. The crystal swayed on its cord as she shook her head. Memories. It was still unclear to her. The room was whirling, her mind was foggy. Nothing made sense. Nothing except... She reached to the ground and grabbed her sword. Grimm's sword. The fight wasn't over yet, not while she was still standing. She wrapped her fingers around the hilt, the feeling all so familiar. The weight of the weapon, however, was not. It took both her arms to lift it. Possessed by a fierce resolve, she stepped over Grimm's body and continued to the foot of the ladder. She ignored the man on the floor, focused on the task ahead. She didn't even hear him moan. Just overhead, she could see a patch of pink sky through the opening in the ceiling. Night was coming to an end. The sun was on its way. Struggling to climb with the heavy sword in tow, she grasped the rungs of the ladder and pulled herself up, the end of her long journey in sight. And for once, she already knew what she would find on the other side. A cool breeze surged past her. It made Annie shiver, even as she breathed in the morning air. Brief as the moment was, her mind began to clear, and she wasted no time before getting to her feet. This was it. She had made it to the top of the tower. But she was forced to halt a second time as she took in the sight before her. The view from the roof was overwhelming. The sky stretching out before her, burning red and orange, the clouds themselves set ablaze by the morning light. The sun had not yet surfaced from its bed in the valley below, but there was no doubt that it would appear within minutes to bathe the distant trees and mountains in its glow. The valley itself was left wide open, unobstructed by any railing or wall that might have cut off the view from the watchtower. Anything of that nature had long since rotted away, leaving the roof flat and exposed under the red sky. Annie saw all of this, awestruck by the sight after her dark journey through the forest. But her eyes did not remain on the horizon for long. Slowly, reluctantly, she allowed her gaze to fall back onto the roof and what rested a short distance from where she stood. A wicker basket. Small, unremarkable, but its size could only suggest the precious package within. For a moment, Annie thought she heard an infant's cries. She felt a terrible urge to dive for the basket, the need to get the child back stronger than ever. But she wasn't alone out there on the roof. Next to the basket, clutching his side as he stood on his knees, was a man. His figure, even from behind, was familiar. Too familiar. The sight was enough to push Grimm's memories aside, if only for an instant. Timothy? He turned around. There was a dark stain on his coat, blood running from his nose. The marks on his hands and face were testament to a recent struggle. But it wasn't the blood or the bruises that frightened her. It was the eyes. Large, yellow eyes, like a goblin's. Annie couldn't look away. You lied. You lied to us. Timothy stared. Annie? Shock, disbelief. He looked to the sword in her hands, alarmed. Why are you here? He cringed as he stood to his feet, keeping his weight off his right leg. Did Saphira send you? But she wasn't listening. She was still fighting to understand. I can't. You couldn't. Why did you do it? The look on her face was desperation. She was searching for answers that didn't exist. The baby. You were the one. And in her confusion, Grimm's steadfast rage was allowed to take over. She gripped the sword with both hands and lifted it back off the ground. You bastard! She yelled. You son of a... Annie! Still holding the basket, he raised his hand. I don't know what they told you, but you have to listen to me. This is my child. This is my son. She stepped forward, guarding the opening that led back down through the roof. I'll kill you. There was nowhere else for him to run. He looked over his shoulder, back towards the blazing sky where the sun was soon to rise. The sight of it set him on edge more than her threats. Listen, Annie. He turned back to her and took a step forward. Put down the sword. We can talk about this inside. She raised the weapon. Annie, please. His voice was shaking. He was desperate. It's me. It's Timothy. The words were so familiar. She felt the sword slipping from her hands. But why did you... She wanted to let him come close, let him explain himself and everything that happened. More than anything, she wanted to trust him. He was still Timothy. But those eyes... A second time, he glanced behind. The sky was even brighter. Just put down the sword. His voice was calm, gentle. He was pleading with her. Let me explain it all to you. He took another step forward. She stayed still. The seconds passed. Her grip on the sword began to weaken. Timothy would explain everything. She knew she could trust him. She wanted to. But Grimm's memories refused to stay buried. They surged upwards once again, rattling her brain and demanding to be heard. The alley, the rain, the fight under the street lamp, all of it was still too fresh in her mind. All of it was coming back. And those eyes... This was not Timothy. Get back! She swung the sword in his direction. He staggered back, nearly dropping the basket. The blade had just missed him. Annie, why won't you listen? He met her gaze, her eyes burning with inexplicable rage. Why won't you... His gaze fell from her face to the crystal around her neck. Understanding came swiftly. He shut his eyes. That crystal. His voice was quiet. That damn blasted crystal. His eyes opened, wide yellow eyes. The pleading, the gentleness was gone. He was furious. Annie held her ground, knowing she had the upper hand. There was no other way off the roof. If he wanted to get down, he would have to go through her. And the long chase had left him weaker than ever. Even if he didn't give up the child willingly, she knew she could beat him. She had to. Again, he looked behind him, the sun threatening to rise in a matter of seconds. Annie! His voice betrayed his panic. Whatever you've seen through that crystal, you have to set it aside. You have to let me pass. She didn't move. Listen to me. I don't have the strength to force you aside. Either you let me pass, or I'll have to kill you. He thrust a battered hand into his coat, pulling out a small object from the depths of his pockets. Don't make me do this! She only stood there, sword in hand, daring him to come closer. She wasn't leaving without the baby, and she wasn't going to stand by and let him escape. One last time, he looked towards the horizon. Strangely enough, he was afraid, deathly afraid. At last, he turned back to her. You are the one to blame. Hatred, bitterness. This is no fault of mine. It's on your own head. Until that moment, she had paid no attention to the object in his hand. But as Timothy brought his fist forward, she caught sight of a small black stone between his fingers. It looked familiar enough to send her mind racing to recognize what it was. And all too late, she remembered. All too late, the stories came back, the images. Her own memories, along with Grimm's memories of a fairy tale and a black crystal. And all too late, she started running. The scream didn't reach him before the name left his lips. Anastasia Green. The scream came out. He didn't move, watching her charge towards him, sword in hand. Any moment, and she would fall. He expected her to. He needed her to. But she didn't fall. Even when her knees should have buckled, when Annie should have collapsed, she kept going. She brought the sword down over his head. He released the basket, raising his hand. The blade hit his arm with a red flash as he tried to protect himself. She kept fighting. Still screaming, she brought the weapon down again and again, driving him back in a blind rage. Annie was gone. Grimm's fury had taken over. Each blow was met with a flash. He had nothing, only his magic, and it was fading. His encounter with Saphira, the fight with Grimm, all of it had eaten away at his strength. He could barely defend himself. He couldn't fight back. One last flash, he felt the metal bite into his skin. He was finished. He raised both arms and grabbed the blade with his bare hands. He staggered back. His heel searched for a hold but found none. Annie was in front of him, on top of him, but there was nothing behind him. He was falling, and she was falling with him. They both fell over the edge. Hey, hi, I'm your narrator, Miranda Eastwood, also the author of The Truth About Goblins. If you liked this chapter, remember to add, follow, or subscribe to this channel so you can hear the next one. And if you didn't like this chapter, oh well, I can't really do anything about that. In any case, I just thought I'd let you know about my Patreon. You can check it out if you'd like to throw some support my way. It would mean a lot to me. Not to mention there's loads of extra exclusive content that I only post on Patreon. While I'm at it, I'll mention that The Truth About Goblins is now available as a complete audiobook, and you can get it wherever you get your audiobooks. Thanks for listening.